Welcome to this interview with Stefania Maurizi. I am Lode van Oost from the Belgian Dutch language news site dewereldmorgen.be. Now, this interview is published in cooperation with the Belgian French language news site Investigative and the weekly magazine Pour. Stefania Maurizi, Italian journalist, has worked before as an investigative journalist for the Italian newspapers La Repubblica and L'Espresso until 2020, and from February 2020 she started working for the major Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano. She is a partner of WikiLeaks already since 2009. She is also, very important for our talk today, the only journalist who has conducted multi-jurisdictional Freedom of Information Act litigation in the US, in the UK, in Australia and Sweden. Why? To access full documentation on the case of Julian Assange. So her work focuses primarily on the abuse of state secrecy, especially when that secrecy is used to conceal state crimes. Stefania also worked with Glenn Greenwald specifically to reveal the Snowden files about Italy. Stefania, welcome. Stefania, we met in Brussels a few weeks ago, where you gave, by the way, a wonderful speech on the importance of free investigative journalism. Now, before we go into the issue of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, can you elaborate a bit more about your investigative work in Italy?
Yes, thank you for having me. So I have worked as an investigative journalist for the last 19 years, so quite a while actually. And I have work on basically on all sorts of issues, but mainly very focused on state secrecy, as you mentioned, because we have a massive problem, even in our Western democracies, unfortunately, where the ordinary people has no access to the information she needs to take the most important decision of their lives. So the ordinary citizens really need independent information, really need investigations, in-depth investigation. This is the main focus that I have had in the last 2 decades. And it has been very, very difficult because, in many countries, you have some sorts of transparency laws. Like, for example, in Sweden, you have a rather good transparency laws, like the Freedom of Information Act. In Italy, we had almost nothing. It is not, it's not a coincidence that we are famous. We are famous for the code of silence, which is one of the rules of the mafia. There is basically no culture of whistleblowing, no culture of speaking out and revealing highly sensitive.
This famous omerta.
Omerta, yes. It is an extremely serious problem because with all their problems, for example, the American citizen have had great whistleblowers. I can mention some. I can mention Daniel Ellsberg, who revealed the Pentagon Papers, exposing how the US government, many US governments, all US governments actually had lied about the Vietnam War, and they knew perfectly well that they had no chance to win the war, and yet they were sending young people in their 20s to die for nothing, for absolutely nothing. So with all their problems, the Americans have this, I'm not sure whether you can call it tradition, but at least they have many important precedents. They had Daniel Ellsberg, they had Chelsea Manning, which she is one of my heroes. She revealed, she spent 8 years and tried to commit suicide 3 times after revealing, sending very important classified information on the Afghan wars, Iraq wars, on the war on terror and Guantanamo. And these documents had been published by WikiLeaks, by Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. Then they had Snowden. So they had many are extremely high-profile whistleblowers. Whereas in Italy, we don't have we don't have this culture of speaking out, of revealing information in the public interest. Let me tell you, let me stress this. So the unauthorized revelation of secret information in the public interest is the core of democracy. There is no democracy if there is not unauthorized revelation of state criminality, extremely serious state criminality like war crimes, like torture, like extrajudicial killing, unless you have unauthorized revelations of this state criminality. Well, you are just relying on official, quote unquote, official version of the facts, official truths, you know? So this is the main focus. I have revealed not just the documentation on which I partnered with WikiLeaks and with Glenn Greenwald, but I also revealed, for example, the confidential agreement between the US government and the family of Giovanni Loporto, who was killed by a US drone strike in Pakistan. And this confidential agreement is the very first written agreement between the US government and the family of an innocent victim which has ever surfaced. And of course, the US authorities take no legal responsibility for it, but for the first time we had a written document which we could understand how they were managing these drone strikes, because they lied for years and years, and there was the CIA telling people, oh, there are no civilian victims, the drone strikes are so precise, so surgical, that there are no civilian victims, no innocent civilian victims, whereas there were hundreds and hundreds of these victims. And these documents is unique, because never before we had a written agreement between the government, the US government, and a family of an innocent civilian killed by a US drone strike. These are some of my works.
Well, you started working because our audience may be wondering, why do we go to an Italian journalist to discuss the issue of Assange in the UK and other things? Because people should know what you have done, especially. You started involving yourself in the case when he was in prison, but you keep working on it even now when he was liberated. What can you tell us about the Assange persecution, and what can you already tell us about the revelation that you managed to do so far?
So actually, I got involved very long time ago in 29.
29.
Before Julian Assange WikiLeaks published the collateral murder video. So basically in 28, WikiLeaks had been founded just 1.5 years before. One of my sources stopped talking to me, and she was convinced she was under illegal interception. And of course, there is no way to know whether you are under illegal interception. It might be a paranoia or it might be true. I mean, there's no way to know. But she didn't want to meet me anymore. So basically, she disappeared, and I never ever learned what she knew. I still don't know what she knew. She wanted to tell me. But I took very seriously that episode. And for me, it was a wake-up call, because I told myself I have to manage my communications with sensitive sources in a much more safe way. Because in these years, in the age of mass surveillance, in the age of surveillance, it's very, very easy to access our communication as journalists. And if we cannot protect our communications when they are extremely sensitive, no one will talk to us anymore, because the sources are scared about talking to us about extremely sensitive things. So, I studied mathematics the university before going to journalism. So I knew there was this thing called cryptography, but I didn't know how to use it. I knew the theoretical, I had the theoretical knowledge because I studied it at the university, but I didn't know how to operate it, how to use it. And in those days, in 28, there was nothing. Cryptography was not user-friendly like, WhatsApp, Signal, Wire, these encrypted chats we had in these days. In those days, we had nothing. We had basically just PGP and a few other things. And so I wanted to learn how to use this cryptography to protect sources. And in those days, there was only one media organization in the world using cryptography systematically. And that media organization was not the New York Times, it was not the Guardian, it was not Spiegel. It was a small, tiny organization, almost unknown to the to the public, very little known, which was called WikiLeaks. It had been established just 1.5 years before. So I knew very little about WikiLeaks. One of my sources in the field of cryptography told me, well, you should have a look on that bunch of lunatics. He was joking. Look at how they do it, because I wanted to learn how to use this cryptography and I didn't know how to do it. So my source suggested me I should look at their work and try to learn from it. And I did, and I was deeply impressed, Lode. I was deeply impressed because they had published amazing documents. They still hadn't published Collateral Murder video, which made them famous around the world. But for example, they had published the Guantanamo Manual, which was an extremely important document. I remember dozens of important journalists had tried to get that document. They didn't succeed to get that document. So when I saw it on the WikiLeaks website, I was deeply impressed. How did they get it? Why they succeeded, whereas other prominent media organization failed? That was and I understood why they did succeed. And the reason why they did succeed was that they basically were offering the sources an encrypted platform to send documentation in a purely anonymous way. So in those years, and I'm not sure if the public remember that after the 9/11, it was a very dark time, not just for the world affairs, not just for how the barbarity we we experienced in those years, but also dark for journalism. The media had an attitude to take seriously what the Pentagon, what the CIA, what the intelligence services were telling the public. Of course, there were exceptions like Seymour Hersh, but in general, journalism was quite, it was quite willing to go after, quite willing to report what the CIA, what the intelligence services, what the US government was telling. We remember the lies on the Iraq war and how the New York Times relaunched the lies about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. We remember of how the Washington Post didn't publish the names of the Western Europe countries in which basically the CIA had black sites. They knew the names, but the US government had told them don't publish the names, and they didn't. So it was not a good time. It was time in which journalism was failing, in my opinion. So in those years, having a media organization willing to offer a platform, an encrypted platform to high-profile sources willing to leak, and having the courage to publish, because you can have the most explosive information, but if you as a journalist don't publish those documents because you are concerned about what can happen to you if you reveal those extremely sensitive documents, they are useless. So the fact that they published, they got the documents, they published it, they had the courage to publish, even if the Pentagon had asked them to remove it from their website because they were not, quote unquote, authorized to publish that document. For me, it was a glimmer of hope in that darkness. So I thought myself, I have to learn from them. I have to track them down, try to meet them, and try to learn from them how to do it, you know? And I started looking at them systematically and started establishing the first contacts. And in July 29, which means 6 months, over 6 months before they published Collateral Murder, they look for me. They contacted me. And I remember it was very late in the night. They called me in the middle of the night and they said, I was sleeping, so I could barely understand what was going on. And they said, we are WikiLeaks. And you have an hour to go to your computer and to download a file. It is a file about Italy. It is in Italian. We need an investigative journalist. We need an Italian journalist who has investigative skills, who can help us to verify the documents and understand the context, understand why it matters, why it is important. We think this document is genuine, but we would like an Italian journalist looking into it. So I rushed to my computer, I downloaded this file, and I remember it was a file about, it was a file about the garbage crisis in Naples in those years where we had this garbage crisis in Naples. And it was a file about the alleged deals between the mafia and the state, the so-called Camorra, which was exposed by the famous Italian writer Roberto Saviano. The Camorra, it is a kind of mafia in Naples, in the Naples region. And I checked the documentation. The documentation was genuine. And I published it in my then newspaper. I was working for the major Italian news magazine, L'Espresso. WikiLeaks published the original file. I published my investigation and some excerpts of the file, of the audio file. WikiLeaks published the entire audio file on its website. And that was the first time I partnered with WikiLeaks. In July, in August, we published on the 6th of August, 29. But I remember my editors were not understanding why I was interested in WikiLeaks, why we should care about these things. WikiLeaks, we have so many problems in Italy. We have unemployment, mafia, we have all sorts of problems. So why we should care about WikiLeaks? But, you know, basically 8 months after this work, WikiLeaks published Collateral Murder and became famous around the world with Collateral Murder. So at that point, they realized why WikiLeaks mattered. And since then, I never stopped working on all documents of WikiLeaks. Among the international journalists, I'm the only one who has worked on the entirety of their secret documents, excepting the very few they publish without any media partner. And in addition to this, I have tried to get the documentation about the case because, you know, unless you have the documents about the legal case, the legal persecution, which Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists experienced after publishing the US government documents, the US classified documents about the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war on terror and the war and the Guantanamo, they experienced an unprecedented persecution, legal and extra-legal persecution. So as an investigative journalist, I think unless you have the documentation, you just have, you know, opinion. That's why it's so important to get the documents about this case.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And you followed the case while he was in prison, but you keep doing that because, as you explained to our here in Brussels, it's important that the documentation is freed because we can learn a lot about how the UK justice system in the first place, but in cooperation with the US, did what they did. And the importance of it is not just to accuse them of what they did wrong, but also to give a warning. This is how they work, and this is what we need to do to avoid this happening again in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, we have seen what happened. As soon as they started publishing these extremely important documents revealing war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, revealing extrajudicial killing, revealing torture, and how the cover-up of these extremely brutal war crimes, extremely brutal crimes, state crimes, uh, of course, there was no way the United States and its allies and all the countries exposed by WikiLeaks, because it's really important to understand that WikiLeaks did not just expose the US crimes. They exposed the US crimes, they exposed the Taliban crimes. If you read the documents on the war in Afghanistan, you see the terrible crimes, for example, of the Taliban, how they use improvised explosive device to massacre civilians. So it was not about just revealing crimes of the United States and its allies. It was revealing crimes of many countries. For example, the cables reveal how the US diplomacy look at Russia, Putin's Russia, how corrupt, how they consider, how they describe Russia, mafia states in their views, of course, but this is how they describe Russia. So these documents are not just about the United States. This is an argument which has been used as a weapon against WikiLeaks. Or WikiLeaks just exposed the crimes of the United States. They are biased. They are in a mission to damage the United States. They expose, this documentation contains, reveal the crimes of many actors who are also enemies of the United States, like the Taliban, like the Russians, and so on. But, you know, as soon as they started revealing these documents, I understood the extraordinary risk they took. They took an extraordinary risk. But of course, the United States could not kill Julian on the spot. They could not do it. They didn't want to appear like an authoritarian state which sent killers to kill journalists who reveal state criminality at the highest level. So they use, this is the very important thing to understand, they use the law. They use lawfare. And the way they use it is something which need to be studied, which need to be reconstructed rigorously. That's why I try to get the documentation, because if we know what really happened, how they did it, we can learn lessons from this, and we can prepare ourselves the next time a new Chelsea Manning, a new Julian Assange, a new WikiLeaks expose state criminality at the highest level. This is why I don't want to give up.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Now, we now know that Assange was liberated 10 months ago in June 23. He's a free man, but he has limitations on his freedom, limitations which we do not have and which he used to continue his case. Now, what you do, what can we also do to keep following up on this issue?
I believe the really important thing is, first of all, to reconstruct what really happened, to make the public opinion understand what really happened. Because many people look at the Julian Assange, who is now free, and say, look, you see how lucky he was not living in an authoritarian state, was not living in North Korea, he was not living in Russia, he was not living in China, and he's free. Of course, yes, now he's free after 14 years, but they took the best years of his life. The price he has paid, the suffering has been unbearable, and no one should pay such a high price in a democracy. It should not happen anything like that. And the only way to prevent that a new Julian Assange, he has to basically to take refuge in an embassy, has to spend 14 years in such torturous conditions, is to understand, to document what really happened, and to make the public opinion aware of the risk and the price. In a democracy, it must be possible to expose state criminality at the highest level. And you don't have to pay 14 years confined or in prison. You don't have to live in exile in Russia like Edward Snowden. You have to be free and safe, because this is what democracy is. This is the difference between democracy and authoritarian states. In authoritarian states, they kill you or they put in prison for life. In a democracy, you have to be able to reveal war crimes, you have to be able to reveal state criminality at the highest level and be free and safe, and not to go through the hell that Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists have been.
Now, before we wrap up, Stefania, just your opinion, why all of a sudden, after 15 years of stubborn prosecution by the UK and the US, did they let him go, which seems, as an outsider, all of a sudden? What has happened there, and how did this come about?
This is a very important question, because it's really important what really happened. They let him go, the United States let him go for a variety of reasons, for several reasons. First of all, they were losing the British case, the British extradition case, because the High Court judges asked the United States government for guarantees on the fact that he would not be discriminated against if extradited and put on trial. And they basically wanted guarantees from the United States that he would enjoy the First Amendment protection, which is basically the only tool, the only shield he could have once extradited to the United States. The First Amendment is key protection, constitutional protection for whoever reveal important information in the public interest. And the US government was unable to provide any guarantee about the First Amendment. They were able to provide guarantees that he would not be put on that penalty. And they did provide guarantees that he would not be put on that penalty. But they were not able to provide guarantees on the First Amendment protection. And at that point, the High Court would have allowed an appeal, and the US would have probably lost the appeal. So at that point, they had an incentive to negotiate a plea deal with Julian Assange, because otherwise they would have lost the British extradition case. But let me tell you, there were many, many factors. So the work by the legal team, the Julian Assange legal team, was excellent, and they were able to get to that point in which basically the US government could not provide guarantees on the fact that he would have enjoyed the First Amendment if put on trial in the United States. And that's number one reason. Number two, they experienced a huge pressure by the public campaign. And here Stella had a very important role, Stella and the family.
Yes, his wife, yes.
Yeah, his wife, Stella Assange, had a very important role, and the family, because even people that basically were not willing to admit that Julian Assange had done extraordinary Julian Assange, WikiLeaks actually had done extraordinary important work. At least they were willing to say, well, he's a human being. He has a wife. He has children. He has a family. So, I mean, all this work by Stella Assange and the family basically made people to provide empathy, to connect to him, to try to understand he's a human being who will go to prison for life for what? For revealing war crimes. Well, there is something deeply wrong in this case. So the campaign and the role of Stella Assange and the family of Julian Assange was absolutely important. And let me stress this point. The campaign has been extraordinarily important, and this should be a good message to citizens around the world. Because, you have, as a journalist, while after I published my book on WikiLeaks, exactly based on 15 years of investigative work on the case, I basically did something like 110 public meeting in Italy and in Europe and in the US in total. And people were looking at me with some skepticism and were like, we are unable to get our municipality to repair the most basic thing. How do you think we can do anything for Julian Assange? How can you think you can do anything for him for such a high-profile legal case? And I was telling them, look, the public pressure is the key, because we have seen how the legal system has been used against him. So it won't be the law which will save Julian Assange. It will be the public pressure. And I was right. It was absolutely the public pressure and all these things. Another important factor was the fact that Joe Biden didn't want an espionage case in an election year. It would be a huge circus, media circus, to have an espionage case in an election year. So all these factors basically put together reach a critical mass, which made the US authorities basically motivated to strike a plea deal with Julian Assange. On the one hand, it's positive because he's safe, he's free and safe. On the other hand, it's terrible because to save his own life, he had to admit he was guilty of journalism, which is terrible, Now we have a precedent, not a judicial precedent, because we don't have a Supreme Court sentence. We have a plea deal, which juridically, legally doesn't make a legal precedent, No. But we have a precedent because now it has been, we have the confirmation that the US government consider the revelation of war crimes, consider the revelations of state criminality as a crime, as a serious crime based on the Espionage Act. So we have, never before we had this. With the Pentagon Papers, we didn't have this. So in the 70s, the press was able to publish the Pentagon Papers about the U.S. war crimes in Vietnam. There was no such precedent. Whereas now we have this precedent, and it is extremely threatening. It's an extremely serious threat for the press, Because the next one who has the next collateral murder video and has the courage to publish the next collateral murder video, he will find himself, she will find herself in the condition of thinking, I may be charged with Espionage Act violations and have to go through the hell that Julian Assange experienced. So it will be a deterrent for many journalists and sources.
Yes, now I want to end, first of all, to pay a little tribute to the Assange Committee in Belgium, in Brussels, who convene every Monday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon at the Place de la Monnaie. They were also part of this deal. Now, to our people here, secret power, WikiLeaks and its enemies. Now, this is the most comprehensive account. If you want to learn about the WikiLeaks case, read this book. Now, I'm going to say something odd. Don't buy it yet, because, as I understood, there's going to be an updated version pretty soon in English, in French, and others.
I hope so. Basically, that is 22, and I have more revelations from my FOI case and so on. So I have a fully updated version in Italian and in German, and I hope to have soon a fully updated version in English, in French, and Spanish. But let me tell one thing, because I really care about this. So we have to learn from this case. We have to learn important lessons, because this case has been fundamental. It is about the freedom of the press, and the freedom of, not just the freedom of the press to reveal war crimes, to reveal state criminality, but also the freedom of the ordinary citizen to know about it. You know, that's really important. It's not just a case about the press. This case about the ordinary people, the little people, right, to know what the state is doing with your money and in your name. That's why it's so important. So we have to learn how the public pressure in this case was crucial, has been crucial. And we will learn lesson that we have the power, and the state want to make us to believe that we are helpless, we are powerless. They want us helpless so that we don't rebel, so that we don't react. But we have seen that we have power, and we change, we all together in different roles, me as a journalist, other as activists, politicians, town councillors, doctors, artists, and so on. Even the Pope who received basically in a private meeting Stella Assange. We reach a critical mass, and this should inspire us to take action and not to give up, and not to think that even with high profile cases where the highest level of power is at stake, is involved, we have the power, and we win. We won. Together we won.
Stefania, and I really must thank you for taking the time and for the wonderful work that you keep doing. I hope so. I also like to thank our followers at De Wereld Morgen and at Investigation and at Pour Magazine. Please keep supporting independent media. Take good care of yourself. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks to all activists and all people who want to fight for the truth.